The dog had not left the grave in 3 days, and the snow had nearly buried him. A man crossing the old cemetery at the edge of town in the gray light saw the shape first and thought it was a drift, until the shape lifted its head. A German shepherd, gone thin, lay curled against a flat marker with snow piled on his back, refusing the warmth of anywhere else, guarding a name cut into frozen stone. The man approached slow, the way you approach an animal that has decided to die where it lies, and crouched, and read the dates on the marker. And then he reached for the ice-crusted tag hanging from the dog's collar and turned it over in his fingers. And whatever was stamped on that tag stopped him cold, stopped a man who had not been stopped by much of anything in 20 years. He knelt there in the snow and said nothing for a long moment. He had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do is read the whole situation before you move. But his hands were not quite steady. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end. What you're about to hear will restore your faith in the people who are still out there quietly paying attention. Let's see how far this journey takes us together. His name was Reed Calloway, and he was 43 years old. Built lean and hard through the shoulders the way men stay built when the habit outlives the reason for it. His dark hair had gone gray at the temples, cropped close. A faded scar crossed the back of one hand and disappeared into his sleeve, the kind of mark a man stops explaining after the 10th time. But it was the eyes people noticed and then looked away from, pale steel blue that seemed to measure exits, hands, voices, and grief without asking permission. And then, having measured, let you be. He moved through the world with the permanent stillness of a man who had nothing left to prove. Not aggression, its opposite. He was not unfriendly by nature. Life had simply down to the parts of him that used to speak first. He watched more than he talked, and when he finally did move, he moved all at once, the way still water becomes a flood. Kandahar had taken friends. The years after had taken the illusion that peace meant quiet. Now Reed lived in the narrow space between discipline and distance, in a small snowbound town in the mountains of Idaho where nobody knew his name, which was exactly how he'd wanted it. Reed had served 14 years in the Navy, the last 9 as a SEAL with 3 deployments, 2 to Helmand and 1 to Kandahar he didn't talk about. He'd left after a compound assault put 2 of his men in the ground and enough metal in his back that the surgeons spent 6 hours deciding what to leave. The discharge had come with a folded flag for another man's wife and a stiffness that woke him on cold mornings. He had carried more men than he could comfortably count, and he had come home to a country that thanked him in airports and forgot him on every road in between. What he carried was simple and heavy. He had spent 14 years standing between people who couldn't protect themselves and whatever wanted to hurt them, and then the Navy had told him he was finished, and he had never worked out what a man like him was supposed to do with a life that no longer needed him. So he'd taken a place in the Idaho high country and did winter caretaking for the cabins in the old church and, it turned out, the cemetery on the hill, and fixed what was broken, because at least a man could finish that. He was checking the cemetery fence line after the storm that morning, expecting nothing, the way he expected nothing from most mornings, until he found a dog dying on a grave. The German shepherd in the snow had no name that Reed knew yet, though he would come to learn it. He was old, 8 or 9, and beneath the gauntness and the snow he was 90 pounds of black and rich amber. His coat darkened along the spine and across both ears. His body built, even now, even failing, like something that had once been assembled for a single purpose. His left ear carried a clean notch, an old wound, an inch from having been worse. Even half frozen, he had the bearing of a trained canine who had long ago learned the difference between noise and threat, and he wasted nothing. He had not wasted a single step away from the grave he had chosen to guard unto his own death. This dog was not Reed's, but Reed knew the instant he saw how the dog held himself even dying exactly what the dog was, a war dog. A trained military working dog, somehow here, in the snow, guarding a grave in a mountain town 1,000 miles from any base. And when Reed turned the frozen tag and read what was stamped there, he understood that the dog was guarding the grave of the only person in the world who had mattered to him, and that the story of how they'd both ended up here was a story that was going to break Reed's heart, and then demand something of him. The town was called Winter Hollow, set high in the snowbound mountains of central Idaho where the timber stood black under white, and the passes closed for days at a time, and the nearest real city was 3 hours down the road. That morning the cold was the deep, killing kind that follows a storm, the sky a flat pale gray, the cemetery on the hill above town a field of stones half buried and silent. It was a beautiful, lonesome place, the kind that pulls a grieving person inward, and Reed had learned that lonesome places are where the lost go. Unnoticed longest, where a dog can lie down on a grave and nearly die before anyone passes by, and where a quiet wrong can sit undisturbed under the snow for a long, long time. The man whose failure lay beneath the story had a name Reed would learn soon enough: Wade Vance, who ran the only assisted living and veterans care facility in that part of the county, a placement home that took in old men with no one left and the modest government checks that came with them. Wade had learned that consequences were for other people, and that the forgotten elderly generate few questions. What Reed would come to learn was that the man in the frozen grave had been a resident of Vance's facility, and that the dog guarding it had been taken from that old man and rehomed against his will to cut costs and clear a complaint, only to slip its new situation and travel miles through the mountains. By some instinct grief gives even to animals, to find the one place its person had finally come to rest. What people knew about Wade Vance was that his facility had beds when no one else did and that he was good at the paperwork. What few had noticed was how quickly the old and alone declined under his care, how their small comforts vanished into his cost-cutting, how a man's service dog, his single reason to hold on, could be declared a liability and taken away by a director who pocketed the difference between the care he billed for and the care he gave. What stood in the way of anyone seeing it was that these were old men with no families and no voices, exactly the people a careful kind of neglect can work on longest. The dead cannot testify. That, as ever, was the design of it. The name on the frozen marker was Harold Briggs, and he had been 81 years old, a Marine of the Korean War, a man who had held a frozen ridge at the Chosin Reservoir as a boy and come home to a long, quiet life and a long, quiet decline. His wife was decades gone. He'd had no children. The war had outlived everyone who remembered it with him. In his last years, the one thing he had left was a German Shepherd, a retired military dog he'd been matched with through a veterans program, named Sergeant, that he called Sarge, that slept at the foot of his bed and walked beside his wheelchair and was, in the truest sense, the last family Harold Briggs had on this earth. When Harold had been moved into Wade Vance's facility, the dog had been allowed at first. And then, when Harold grew frail and difficult and his complaints became inconvenient, the dog had been taken from him and sent away. Harold Briggs had died 11 days later. The staff wrote natural causes. The truer cause had 4 letters and a name, and it was the absence of the only thing he had left to live for. Even in the manner of his dying, Harold had carried himself with the dignity of his generation, never raising his voice, never making a fuss, asking only, the nurses would later admit, after his dog again and again until he stopped asking and then stopped altogether. The contrast was the whole injustice in a single image: an old Marine who had survived the Chosin Reservoir, dying alone and heartbroken in a warm bed, because a man counting dollars had taken away the one creature that loved him, while that creature, rehomed miles away, had broken loose and crossed a frozen mountain to lie down on his grave and refused to leave it. Reed read the tag and the truth of it landed on him all at once. Sarge, and beneath it a Veterans Service Dog Program registry and a handler's name, Harold Briggs, that matched the name cut into the stone the dog was dying on. The dog had not wandered to a random grave. The dog had come home to his person, the only way left to him. Reed went very quiet, the way he used to go quiet, right before everything happened at once, except this time the quiet had grief in it. He took off his own coat and wrapped the freezing dog in it, and he did not try to pull Sarge off the grave by force. He simply gathered all 90 failing pounds of him up against his chest, said low, "Come on, Sergeant, I've got you. Your man would want you to live," and carried him down the hill out of the snow. Wade Vance did not back down, because men like Wade Vance never back down from the neglect they've built their living on. Over the days that followed, once Sarge was warm and fed and slowly, stubbornly choosing to live, Reed learned the shape of it. He didn't accuse anyone at first. He asked questions the patient way he'd been trained to. He traced the dog's registry to the Veterans Program, and the program's records to Harold Briggs, and Harold Briggs to the last address on file, Wade Vance's facility. And then he learned the rest, from a place that made his jaw set hard, that the dog had been removed from a dying veteran as a liability, rehomed without consent to a property down the valley it had promptly fled, and that Harold was far from the only resident whose comforts and dignity had been quietly stripped to pad a budget. There was a pattern, There were other old men. There was an accounting owed. The ally arrived in the form of a former nurse from the facility, a woman named Carol Reyes, who'd quit rather than keep signing off on what she saw, and who heard a caretaker up the mountain had found Harold Briggs's dog alive on his grave. "You found Sarge," she said, and her voice broke on it. It wasn't a question. She'd been there the day they took the dog. She'd heard the old man ask for him until the end. She'd kept her own quiet records, the stripped care, the vanished comforts, the dog removed against a dying man's will, the deaths that came too soon and too conveniently. She'd sat on it, afraid, because Vance held the only beds in the county. She gave Reed a name, the state's Adult Protective Services and a veterans advocacy organization, neither of whom owed Wade Vance a thing. Sarge understood, in his way, before the humans finished. As his strength came back, he attached himself to Reed with the total commitment of a working dog who has chosen his person, but he grieved too, in the way dogs grieve, and on the day Reed first took him back up the hill to the grave, the dog lay down on it gently and was at last calm, as though he had needed to know his man was still there. Reed let him stay a while. Then he brought him home. For the first time, Sarge was not dying of a loyalty no one had honored. Someone had finally seen what the dog had been trying to say. Reed made the call and laid it out flat: the elder neglect, the service dog removed from a dying veteran, the stripped care, the too convenient deaths, the records Carol Reyes had kept. He didn't raise his voice. He'd been trained to brief command, and he briefed it. "You've done this before," the investigator said. "Seen enough of it," Reed said. Wade Vance moved first, the way the powerful always do when they feel the ground shift. Word reached him that a mountain caretaker was asking about a dead resident and a dog that should have been long gone, and Wade did what protected the facility. He moved to have the dog declared an abandoned stray with no provable tie to his care, disputing the registry. And he reached out to paint Carol Reyes as a disgruntled former employee before any state investigator gave her weight. He scheduled his denials for a window he assumed the snow and the distance would keep anyone from closing. He had not counted on a SEAL who'd already carried the proof down off the mountain. Carol, told the facility, was now claiming the dog couldn't be tied to Harold at all and that the old man had simply died of age. Felt the despair of it, the certainty that the powerful always won, that a dead old man and a grieving dog would never count against a director's clean paperwork. She nearly let it go again, but this time she wasn't alone with it. And Reed was already moving, because 14 years had taught a man named Reed Calloway to be in the room before the thing he was guarding against arrived. The confrontation came at the facility, where Wade Vance had assembled with the documents to close the matter, and where Reed walked in instead with the state investigator, the veterans advocate, Carol Reyes, and Sarge on a leash at his side. The dog walked into that building and stopped, every hair on him rising, and fixed on Wade Vance with a low sound that came from somewhere deep, recognition and grief and judgment, and placed himself square in the man's path. 90 pounds of a loyalty that had crossed a frozen mountain and would not be moved. The room had gone quiet, not silent quiet, the kind of unnatural drop in sound that trained people notice immediately. Reed stepped forward, slow, and nobody moved. "You'll want to stop talking about strays," Reed said. Vance's administrative smoothness was already hardening. "That animal is an unidentified stray. This is a licensed care facility. That resident died of natural causes at an advanced age, and you have no standing here whatsoever. I run this home. Do you have any idea who I am in this county?" "Senior Chief Petty Officer Reed Calloway," Reed said, and his voice never rose. "United States Navy, 14 years, 3 deployments. 9 of those years I had exactly one job, standing between people who couldn't protect themselves and whoever wanted to hurt them. So no, I don't much care who you are in this county." He looked down at the dog pressed against his leg. "But I'll tell you who he is. His name is Sargent. He was a retired military working dog, matched to a Marine named Harold Briggs, Korea. The Chosin Reservoir, the last family that old man had in the world. You took this dog away from him while he was dying because the dog was inconvenient and the math was better without him. Harold asked for him until he couldn't ask anymore. He was dead in 11 days. Reed's jaw was tight, and this dog you called a stray broke loose, crossed these mountains in the snow, and lay down on Harold's grave to die there guarding it. I found him 3 days in. So don't you say stray to me again?" "You can't. This is Adult Protective Services," the investigator said, stepping forward with a folder, "with an open investigation into this facility. We have the dog's registry. That's a positive identification tying him to Mr. Briggs, not a guess. We have the records Ms. Reyes kept, the care you stripped, the dog removed against a dying man's will, the deaths that came too fast. And we have other families' names now. He set it down. This isn't getting closed quietly. Every resident your cost-cutting touched is part of it now. Vance's composure cracked. Those are administrative decisions. You can't prove intent. My facility is fully licensed. I'll have. This isn't over, Vance tried, but the words came out smaller than his license had ever let them come. It was over. He just hadn't caught up to it yet. The investigation moved past that office and did not stop. Sarge's identity was confirmed beyond dispute. The link to Harold Briggs established, the records pulled. Wade Vance's facility was placed under state intervention, and his license suspended as the investigation traced a pattern of neglect across years of forgotten residents. The case building name by name, old man by old man in front of the staff who'd been ground down into silence and who now, at last, came forward with what they'd carried, because someone Vance couldn't fire had made it safe to speak. A nurse near the door covered her mouth with her hand. Nobody spoke for a long time after that. Reed didn't watch them deal with Vance. He'd crouched beside Sarge, who had stopped growling now and simply leaned, exhausted and grieving and alive, into the only person who had bothered to understand what he'd been trying to say all along. Reed put a hand on the dog's notched ear. "You did your job, Sergeant," he said quietly, and his own voice was not steady. "You stayed with your man right to the end, and past it. Nobody could have done it better. He knows. Wherever he is, he knows." The dog pressed his head into Reed's chest. "You don't have to guard him alone anymore. I've got it now. I've got you." 8 months later, the late spring sun came down warm and golden over a small cabin on a green Idaho mountainside, the snow long gone, the high meadows full of wildflowers, the timber soft and alive in the wind. Reed sat on the porch step with a cup of coffee, his bad back stretched out long, and Carol Reyes, who'd found honest work again and a measure of peace in finally being heard, sat beside him with iced tea, and neither of them said much, because they didn't need to. Out in the meadow, an old German shepherd lay in the sun, filled out and easy now, gray coming in around the notched ear, his eyes half closed against the light, his tail moving slow and content through the grass. He was old and he was tired, and he was no longer guarding a grave in the cold. He was simply home. The investigation had reached far past one dog and one grave. Wade Vance's neglect unraveled into charges spanning years. His facility was taken over and remade under honest management that treated the old and forgotten as people again, and the state wrote new protections so a dying man's last comfort could never again be taken to balance a budget. The nurses he'd silenced were vindicated, and Harold Briggs, who had died believing he'd lost everything, had not been forgotten after all. A veterans organization, hearing the story, had seen to it that his grave on the hill received a proper military marker, his name and his rank and his war cut clean into new granite. The Chosin Reservoir remembered at last. Reed still did his caretaking up the mountain, and the cemetery on the hill was part of his rounds. On the first Saturday of every month, when the weather allowed, he drove up to that hill, with Sarge riding beside him, and he let the old dog out, and Sarge would walk, slow now dignified, to Harold Briggs's grave and lie down on it in the sun for a little while, not in grief anymore, but in something more like visiting, the way the living sit with the ones they loved. And then the dog would rise, and come back to Reed, and the two of them would drive home together. A man who had spent years not knowing what he was for had found, in an old grieving dog on a frozen grave, exactly what he was for. Sarge no longer ran anywhere. He was old and content and home. But he lifted his gray head every time Reed came near and leaned into his hand, and his tail never quite stopped. Peace had arrived. The story was over. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they're found half buried in the snow on a frozen grave, in the shape of an old dog who loved a man so completely that he crossed a mountain to die guarding what was left of him. The world isn't saved by superheroes. It's saved by ordinary people who read the tag and refuse to look away from what it tells them, and by animals who carry a loyalty so vast and so faithful that human language has never once been adequate to hold it. God does not always spare the faithful the cold, or the lonely, or the quiet cruelty of those who count dollars where they should count souls. Harold Briggs died asking for his dog, and there's no undoing that grief. But sometimes, in his mercy, a love that's strong is not allowed to vanish into the snow unseen. Sometimes it lies down on a grave and waits for someone with the heart to understand it and the will to make it right. Sarge guarded his master past the master's death because, to a dog like that, loyalty does not end at a graveside. It simply changes into keeping watch. He believed he would do it alone until the cold took him too. He was wrong. The miracle wasn't that a cruel man was finally held to account, though he was. It was that an old war dog's impossible, mountain-crossing faithfulness was witnessed at last by a man who knew exactly what it meant, and who knelt down in the snow and promised that no one who loved like that would ever have to keep watch alone again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty outlasts even death, and that the forgotten still deserves someone to read the tag and refuse to walk away. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us, have you ever witnessed a love that wouldn't quit even at the graveside, or been the one who stopped to understand it? Your story may be the one that reminds another person not to mistake faithfulness for a stray. And if you believe in stories of service, loyalty, and the quiet courage of ordinary people, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and watch over every old soldier who died asking after the one who loved him, and every faithful dog still keeping watch in the cold over a name cut into stone.